Just as colonial powers once seized lands and resources, modern corporations and wealthy nations are now doing the same under the banner of environmentalism.
We're talking in a matter of decades. That entire community and society could be wiped out from the face of the earth.
Climate change is threatening the people of Kiribati. Sea levels are rising, storm surges and severe tropical storms are flooding the sparsely populated country with increasing frequency.
But the key element about landscape restoration is working with local communities on the ground to do landscape restoration to meet their needs.
I think when we look on the sky, it seems as if it will rain soon.
Are you happy with it?
I'm very happy with it because it's the mother of all living things.
Hi, welcome back to my channel. So this is going to be a video essay on green grabbing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's based off a paper that I wrote in my final year for my post-colonial politics class. So to start off with part one, before understanding what green grabbing is, it's important to understand the concept of climate coloniality. And this is based off a paper written by Sultana in 2022 called The Unbearable Heaviness of Climate Coloniality. So basically, it looks at how the impacts of climate change are linked with histories of global racial capitalism, colonial dispossession, and climate debts. And basically, the paper describes how we can see there's like a historical thread that shows that that's basically stemming from colonialism, that shows the impact, the differences in terms of different regions and how they're experiencing climate change, specifically the differences between the global north and the global south. So to expand on that, the actions of the quote-unquote rich nations in the global north, where there's high demand and where there's extreme consumerism, it can lead to environmental and economic apartheid, where the poorest and most marginalized communities are actually bearing the brunt of climate change, and those tend to be communities in the global south. So, for example, we can see the differences in countries and how they're experiencing the climate crisis, where we have, yes, for example, in the UK, like, let's say we're having change in temperatures, like let's say our summers aren't as hot or our winters aren't as cold. But then when you see the extreme differences in actual places in the global south, such as the island of Tuvalu, which is basically slowly disappearing.
The world is on fire.
It's now too late to leave. Seek shelter as the fire approaches.
The glass is melting. The sea is rising.
The climate time bomb is ticking.
My paradise is at the very front line and will soon be paradise lost.
Tuvalu is literally sinking. We must take action now.
Where you have different other regions in the global south whose harvests and agriculture is being impacted.
The other season we were crying, no rain. Now we are talking of flood. Everything is being contradicting.
We can see the differences and disparities in how different areas are experiencing climate change, and that is a strong link to colonialism, especially when the countries that are bearing the brunt of it the most actually tend to be the least contributors to the climate crisis themselves. So the paper goes on to talk about how if we want to decolonize the concept of climate change, we need to not just confront the idea of how much carbon are people emitting in different regions, but actually confronting and looking at colonial ideologies and systemic racism that is still being perpetuated through the climate crisis. So Sultana stresses in the paper that in order for us to move past that, and in order for us to actually save the planet properly and save the planet for people in the future to come, and to actually help people in the global south, there needs to be a actual sense of global solidarity that is seen in law and policy and in material distribution and in reparations. So part two, what is green grabbing? It's called the appropriation of land and resources for environmental ends. And these environmental ends could include biofuel production, ecosystem services, protecting biodiversity, ecotourism. So all these environmental ends are usually seen as positives, so positive consequences. The environmental ends that I just listed can be seen as positive things, but this appropriation of land and nature, the exact same appropriation of land and nature that we see in the name of the environment, was exactly done for colonialism and imperialism. So it's basically the same methods that were being enacted in the past are being done now, but now it's being disguised and covered in the name of like saving the environment and helping the climate crisis and key kind of buzzwords like that. The concept of green grabbing, we can see it a lot in the global south in countries such as Mexico, Kenya, Tanzania, Guatemala, and the examples that I kind of learned about were looking at things like land grabbing for biofuels in Tanzania, looking at carbon colonialism in Uganda, and looking at also ecotourism in Guatemala and how that impacts the indigenous communities that live there. But specifically, the case study that I used was Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2008, there's a Guardian article by John Vidal where he talks about how green grabbing is loaded with colonial overtones due to how it includes the practice of excluding and displacing a lot of indigenous people from their land. And the article talks about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where in the 1990s, the Bambuti Batwa tribe in Eastern Congo had their lands taken away from them simply to create the Virunga National Park, which was said to protect the gorillas. You can see the similarities in terms of past and present, where in the past, during colonialism, people were kicked out and moved out of their lands. But this was said to spread culture, to spread religion, to spread certain ideologies, to improve a nation. But this time, the Bambuti Batwa tribe were kicked out in order to protect gorillas in the name of conservation, because obviously animals going extinct is still an important agenda. But the way that it's being done through the appropriation of land that already belonged to a group of people for generations. Now, the Virunga National Park still exists today, and it's listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site due to its biodiversity. So since 2008, the situation has worsened for people in the Batwa tribe, as in 2017, it was found that the development projects have had militarizing effects, causing violent dispossessions of anyone in the tribe who tries to move back into their ancestral land, which this has been coined as the term green violence. And this can be seen in different areas in the global south. This can also be seen in places like Nepal, where in the name of conservation, indigenous people are being kicked out and violence is being enacted onto them simply for wanting access back to their own ancestral land, to their homes. The next parts kind of look at what we can unpack from these case studies. So part 3 looks at who is the expert. In Sultana's paper, they talk about how only certain voices are being prioritized when it comes to providing expertise and insight into climate change. And these certain voices that are being prioritized are based off power relations stemming from colonialism. So if we use the continent of Africa as an example, the idea of Africa by V.Y. Mundembe, he talks about how Africa is an imagined construct, which makes it part of a large stereotypical discourse. And this kind of links to contributions of climate change because it leaves people with the perceptions that Africans, especially those in marginalized areas, are passive instead of active actors when it comes to the climate discourse. And instead of indigenous populations actually being seen as the owners of their own land, they're simply just seen in the background or left to be in the background, especially when it comes to the discussion. And it kind of links to how the whole global south is seen as people who are to be studied and objectified and exploited from, instead of individuals who are actually capable of creating theory and knowledge and contributing to a discussion. And this leads to this ethnocentric bias that we have, which allows people from the global north to define the problems and propose solutions instead of working in solidarity with people from the global south. So as a consequence, we're left with people from the global north who are white passing, who tend to be male, and these experts dominate the conversations over those who are actually experiencing the dramatic effects of climate change. We can tangibly see this in the modern day with whitewashing, especially in international conservation groups such as WWF and parts of the World Bank, which these are the people who are the main actors in buying and leasing these national parks from relatively poorer governments. And these groups tend to be the ones that are allowed to dictate how land inside the park should be used without actually consulting indigenous people who have lived there for centuries. And international institutions such as UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, play a really big role in allowing indigenous populations to be displaced by local actors on the ground, because UNESCO claim that their main activity is to help to establish and secure World Heritage Sites of natural importance. And even if UNESCO's agenda is still of importance, because yes, it is important to secure World Heritage Sites and to preserve things like biodiversity, it's still important for us to be able to critically analyze the actual idea of the UN and these different agencies. So when we look at these key leadership positions and places of power within UN agencies, we really have to critique even the idea of veto power and superpower countries. The fact that 5 countries have veto power and none of them are from the continent of Africa. At the end of the day, these superpower countries and these countries with veto power have a lot of political and economic influence, and they tend to be the biggest contributors to agencies such as UNESCO. For example, the top 5 contributors to UNESCO in 2023 were China, Italy, the EU, Japan, and France. And when even applying to the case study of Congo are not even in the top 100. So at the end of the day, there's a geopolitical imbalance, which means that indigenous communities are lacking a voice on the global stage, because even when you take into account maybe places or certain countries in the global south that do have a voice on that stage, when do you regularly see indigenous communities from the areas in the global south that are able to have that same voice? So part 4 looks at what type of knowledge is even seen as valuable in the discussion of climate change. Sultana talks about how the type of knowledge that is valued in the climate discourse is Western-centric and overlooks other traditional forms of knowledge that can be just as valuable, especially those that are in the global south. So what does Western-centric knowledge look like? It's Europatriarchal, it's usually separate from emotions, it's separate from spirituality, it's rigid, and it was initiated by elite European men. And there's a strong emphasis on assessment and quantification being the highest forms of understanding, and implies that any other forms of understanding tend to be inferior. So with Western-centric knowledge, quantifiable and binary information is valued more in the climate discourse. And green grabbing is rooted in this way of thinking. And this has led to the commodification of nature, which makes nature a source of profit. And apply this back to the case study in Congo, scientists have been able to estimate that the Democratic Republic of Congo approximately has 22 billion metric tons of carbon stored in the biomass of forests and woodland savannas, which have led to additional pressures to conserve forests. Now we can see how that kind of the quantification of nature and that perception of nature has led to the idea that we need to conserve forests, especially in terms of the climate discourse, when actually there are other ways that people have perceived nature, and there are other ways that Congolese people have perceived nature throughout time, whether that be looking as nature as living and breathing and being part of nature, whether that be different ways of giving and receiving from nature, whether that be to do with harvesting and rearing and agriculture. But when, in terms of the climate discourse, what is being prioritized is the quantification of nature and not other forms of knowledge that are just as valuable. In the battle culture, they see the forest as a temple that has great spiritual value, and they see themselves as guardians of the forest, going beyond an economic understanding. And these forms of knowledge are what Mina Salami calls sensuous knowledge, where the quantifiable and immeasurable and intellectual and emotional are all seen as valuable. There is value in all types of information, and not one is superior than the other. And there's no hierarchy regarding which information carries more value. And that is what we need to start including in the climate discourse. Final part 5, looks at how all this information can be used to decolonize the climate. And Sultana says that decolonizing the climate can only be done through amplifying voices from the global south and include multiple ways of knowing when coming up with responses on how to tackle it. So the first thing is changing the expert. We need to look at whose voices are missing from the conversation, and we need to uplift them. And an example of this can be transnational activism, where organizations are fighting green grabs by assisting small farmers to maintain community control over their own biodiversity. For example, in Congo in 2015, the International Land Coalition worked with grassroots organizations such as the Programme for the Integration and Development of the Pygmy People, alongside religious leaders, government officials and company executives, and they were able to pass a new law recognizing the rights of indigenous people, providing them easier access to justice and basic social services, and officially recognizes their customs and traditions. A key part of the amendment was making it compulsory for indigenous people to be consulted in their own language. another way of decolonizing the climate is looking at other forms of knowledge and not just prioritizing Euro-patriarchal knowledge and seeing it as superior. We should be consciously prioritizing other forms of knowledge that can bring us to more sustainable and equal climate decisions, especially because with Indigenous people and their land, they have lived on there for generations. So their knowledge and how they have preserved their own land should be just as valuable. So policy making needs to be more reflective in order to challenge this normalization of only one form of knowledge and incorporate Indigenous knowledge and expertise. Because when we respect and empower Indigenous worldviews, we can create an inclusive climate policy that doesn't leave Indigenous communities at risk of displacement, exclusion, and violence. This is a really good form of intellectual resistance because we're challenging the assumption that Indigenous people are just people to be studied and to be theorized about. They are also people who theorize. They are also the communicators. They are also the researchers, and they are people with the lived experience. And another way we can challenge universal truths is also rethinking how we write and represent the natural world when it comes to climate change. So we're going to get into a bit of philosophy here, but in philosophy, there's a Latin phrase called terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one. And this was used in the colonial expansion to justify the acquisition of territories. So when people from the West were, quote unquote, finding new pieces of land, there was an assumption that, oh, this belongs to no one, so I can claim it. This is now happening again with climate change, but the term is now carbon nullius, where we're treating the carbon stored in the trees as if it doesn't belong to anyone. When the carbon in those trees, the nature, it did belong to people, and it has belonged to people for generations. Because what we're doing, allowing these communities to be displaced and excluded, is that we're ignoring the histories of people who have lived and depended on these forests for generations, and it enables external entities and institutions to exploit carbon resources without considering local impacts. One way of doing that practically is advocating for Indigenous people to have access to using their land for how they've been using it for generations. And this form of resistance is shown in the Virunga National Park, as well as overt political resistance through collaborating with government officials. There's covert implicit tactics as well that can be used by the local population to resist these conservation practices. And one of these examples is including the continuation of their livelihood practices that have been banned, such as agriculture and spiritual customs regarding organizing access to land. So by advocating for them to still have access to the land, whether it be spiritually or whether it be through rearing and agriculture, this is also a way of decolonizing the climate. I'd end the essay with saying that conservation and environmentalism is deeply political. So control of natural and symbolic resources such as land is so much more than just saving the planet. I really enjoyed writing this paper, and I found it really interesting because at the beginning of that course, I tended to have a perception of the climate crisis to be filled with very white-passing, white-presenting people, simply because that's what was just always in the media, specifically with Just Stop Oil, or specifically with just the figures that were being uplifted in the mainstream media. But then you realize, as a Black person living in the global North, the climate crisis really, really does affect you, not just because of your day-to-day living in the global North, but because when you think about your homeland and where you're from, it's actually impacting them at a much greater extent and their daily lives. I might complain about the difference, or we might complain about, oh, there's a change, oh, summer's not summering anymore, winter's not wintering anymore. But for some people, their lands are disappearing, they're being kicked out, they're being displaced, they're not getting their food. So when you take that into consideration, you actually realize how active you need to be when it comes to the climate crisis. And it's interesting to see how these are simply continuations of colonial logic, thinking, and understanding. So I think it's kind of an encouragement to all people to really think about climate solutions critically, because it really is affecting people disproportionately, especially when you look at even the hurricanes in the Caribbean. So it's important that we rid our biases and kind of move forward with those at the global majority at the forefront. In terms of book recommendations, as well as the paper that has basically like informed this whole essay, Mikaela Loach, It's Not That Radical, I really do recommend, because it kind of puts into perspective that saving the climate crisis, the fight against climate change, it is not a radical concept. It is so possible. And sometimes the media can make it look as if it's something that's far-fetched or something that's not achievable or something that's not attainable, when it really is, when you do the research, when you do the reading, or when you watch the videos, because, you know, it's not everyday worship over the written word. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, that's what I would end with. Read Mikaela Loach. It's not that radical. Hey, we done it. That was hard.